Welcome back for another Friday Night In with 10 Minute Horror. We've got the first half of a two-parter headed your way tonight, so mix yourself a stiff one and strap in. This is Don't Look Behind You. We met once a month. It was always a Friday at our house. My younger brother Davey and I started a horror club with my two best friends, Jeff and Brad. We talked our parents into letting us have the club on the last Friday of every month, where we would inhale a few bags of chips, a couple bottles of Coke and Sprite, and watch 2 or 3 horror flicks. We'd also go over horror comics we'd read, the occasional horror board game or two, anything and everything horror related really. We were obsessed. The typical Friday would go that Mom or Dad would pick the 4 of us up from school and take us directly to Rogers or Blockbuster to go through the vast sections of VHSs to rent, though we'd spend the whole time in the horror section, occasionally dipping into thriller. There was a deal for 5 rentals for the weekend, so our parents would get 1 choice and we'd get 4 for the night. We'd watch 1 before dinner, then 3 in a row right after. Davey and I shared a room with a bunk bed and had a TV and a VCR in it, so Jeff and Brad would sleep on the floor on Mom's yoga mats and we'd try to stay up all night, but we'd all usually be out cold by 1 a.m. Stacy, our older sister, always came home around that time. I could hear her lame boyfriend Craig's car engine from several blocks away. Sometimes she'd come in and try to scare us. Once, she got Craig to climb up the side of the house and bang on the windows with a gnarly mask on. That sent us. I was usually the last one awake, and I'd stay up thinking about all the crazy stories and monsters we'd just watched. I'd rate them against one another on their scariness. If there were any snacks left, I'd finish them in bed, up on the bunk, while looking back over the covers of the movies we'd rented. The next morning, we'd all have breakfast and talk about the different flicks we'd watched and maybe rewatch the last one we'd fallen asleep to. Brad or Jeff's parents would pick them both up before lunch and everyone's lives would return to normal. And I'd be waiting for the next month to come. This Horror Club Friday finally came, and with it, Jeff had a surprise for us. But first, the video store. We rented Creepshow 2, Fright Night, The Blob, the color version, and Tremors. I'd seen Tremors and Creepshow 2, but Brad and Jeff hadn't, and they were pretty fun movies, so we agreed on them. We started with those 2 before moving on to The Blob, which none of us had seen, but all immediately loved. It was now 10:30, and Jeff was ready to break out his surprise. We'd all wondered what it was, sitting in a large garbage bag in the corner the entirety of the night. Jeff explained he was out with his mom at an old boutique-style bookstore. It was filled with antiques and ancient film reels, records, and a small VHS selection. He scanned through the VHSs, hoping for some horrors, but found only old classics. There was one, though, in a plastic case with a homemade label. It sat on a large rectangular box the size of a board game, which was what it was. When Jeff told us, we all got super excited. We'd heard of VHS board games like Nightmare and Atmosphere, but hadn't ever seen one or played it. Even though this one looked to be completely homemade, it had some frightening artwork on the cover. And when we opened the box to see the actual game, it was as thick as a cutting board and just as heavy. The board was covered in zigzagging pathways, all stemming from one corner of the board and arriving at the center, where a pop-up structure of a cabin was marked with the word home. Since it was a 4-player game, each corner of the board had a starting place, and we each got a figurine token for a playing piece. Each piece was small and metal, in the shape of a child, with the paint and colors smeared and faded. Each child's mouth was open in a scream. The 4 corners were all different, from a graveyard, to a forest, to a haunted mansion, to a slaughterhouse. The objective of the game seemed to be for each of us to get to the middle of the board, or home, from whichever frightening origin point we started from. A simple 4-sided die with the numbers 1 through 3 pushed you forward, while the 4th side would send you 1 step back. Every path moved through other paths like a maze and interacted with its origin point surroundings. Whether it was a path through the forest leading to a dead end or a hallway in the slaughterhouse into a meat locker, you had to pay attention to your path because of the other element to this game. While your player was trying to get home, there was an additional figurine that moved on its own across the board, trying to catch you. I read the back of the box, and it sounded like the inner workings of the board were filled with gears similar to a watch. They were powered by negative and positive magnets, which were the individual pieces and board, and charged up whenever they were near each other. The villain figure must be more attracted magnetically to certain other figures, which would make the choosing of our pieces all the more important. But how could you tell? The VHS came into play, acting as a sort of hour-long timer counting down. If you didn't get home before the timer ran out, you were locked out, but you wouldn't be alone. The figurine that chased the players was in the shape of a dark, cloaked man with long, stringy hair. As far as board game tokens go, he was the scariest one I'd ever seen. He towered over the other ones. I didn't even want to look at him, which made the VHS that much more unsettling. That stringy-haired man filled the screen, which was half covered by shadows. You could only really see parts of the side of his face and his eyes, which were white as milk. When he spoke, it sounded like glass breaking. He introduced himself as the Harvester of Souls and looked forward to getting to know ours. The Harvester welcomed us to the game, which was called Don't Look Behind You. He instructed us to take our places on the board as the timer was about to begin. It glowed in red at the bottom of the screen. 1 hour. We had 1 hour to get to the center of the board. We took turns with the die, each rolling and making our first moves. Brad started. He was in the dark forest. Then it was Jeff, who was in the graveyard. Then Davy, who had the slaughterhouse. And me, who landed on the haunted mansion. My first roll brought me 3 places forward, and the closest to home. My token was in a curving hallway leading towards a staircase to the first floor. My heart was racing. Then, the Harvester's piece moved. 3 places. It was going towards Brad in the forest. We all oohed and awed at the untouched token. The Harvester spoke through the TV, asking if the player was afraid of forests. Brad, caught off guard, looked to us and shrugged. The Harvester said he was about to be. Brad rolled again. A 3. He landed on a card pickup. He nervously turned the card over and found an image of the young boy that was on his token. The boy was walking through the dark forest on a slim, barely lit path. The Harvester was amongst the shadows, half his face lit by moonlight sprinkled through the trees. But his face, what we could see of it, wasn't that silky porcelain. It was bark-like, rotted wood. But his eyes were still white and glared at the boy. At the bottom of the card, the words, "Don't look behind you," were written. Down on the board, we realized the Harvester's token had moved and was now headed towards Brad. Brad got angry, though it felt more scared than anything. Brad stared at the card. I could see how uneasy it made him. He looked over his shoulder, checking behind him. Jeff called him out on it, and we all laughed. Then it was Jeff's turn. His token was walking down a path between graves, but landed on an empty one, which meant he lost a turn. Then it was Davy, and he was making his way through the bleeding out room of the slaughterhouse. We continued on through several turns, with each of us making our ways through the frightening locations. The Harvester was on the screen the whole time, staring down at us, watching. It really felt like he was. The one eye we could see seemed to track whoever was playing. I could even detect a smile here and there when one of us would choose to go left instead of right down a fork in our pathways. The Harvester's token caught Brad in the darkest part of the forest. As it did, his voice came over the screen, announcing Brad was no longer in the game. Brad sat back in a huff, his token tipped over. Jeff was the next one to land on a card pickup. To get through the graveyard, he had to walk through a mausoleum and landed on a bad square. The card showed Jeff's token walking through the halls of the mausoleum. One coffin had been pulled out of the wall, its lid opened. The Harvester was peeking out from inside, half his face hidden by a shadow. The visible half had been zombified, rotted, and grotesque. At the bottom of the card, again, the words, "Don't look behind you," were written. Suddenly, Brad pointed behind Jeff and screamed. Jeff spun, panicking to see, but nothing was there. Brad was just pranking him. Jeff had turned, though, and looked. Down on the board, the Harvester's piece was now turned towards Jeff. Within 2 turns, Jeff's token had been caught, and that frightening voice came over the TV again. He was no longer in the game. It was just Davy and I now. I was nearing the front door of the haunted mansion, and Davy was almost out of the slaughterhouse. We were coming from opposite ends of the board, and almost in the safety of the home finish point. The Harvester's next turn brought his token between mine and Davy's. He could reach one of us. The other would likely make it home, but one wouldn't. He decided to turn towards my little brothers. Davy rolled and landed on the final card pickup before the front steps of home. He lifted the card and stared at the image. It was his token, the little boy walking through the slaughterhouse. Behind him, the Harvester had a chain metal apron on. He carried a large electric bone saw in his hands. He was covered in blood. His one visible, milky white eye was aimed at the little boy in the image, and with that, the harvester's token was right behind my brother's. The voice whispered out from the screen, "Don't look behind you." Davy screamed, spinning around and staring up at the TV. The harvester was looking down at him. A crooked smile formed. My dad knocked on our door, scaring us all even further. He told us it was time to go to bed. Davy snapped off the TV, vanishing the harvester's face from our visions just as he was beginning to outright laugh. We all decided to call it a night. We turned off the lights and I climbed up onto my bunk. Davy was already under his covers, only his face poking out. He didn't look okay. Jeff packed the game up and put it away. Then him and Brad tucked into their sleeping bags. The room was pitch black. All I could hear was 4 sets of hushed breathing. Everyone was still scared. I could tell we were all still thinking about the game. It really was creepy, and some of the things the harvester said felt personalized. I knew Davy had a fear of slaughterhouses. He'd seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in one of our first club meetings, and he still hadn't recovered. I also knew Jeff hated graveyards because of his grandpa's funeral, and Brad hated forests because he'd been lost during a childhood camping trip. We were all scared of plenty of things, though. I knew I was just trying to scare myself now, and tried to think of the movies we watched. But my mind kept inserting the harvester's face and voice into my memories. Everything kept leading back to him. Then I got really nervous. I remembered one time when Brad had brought over a Ouija board for the club. It was kind of fun. I didn't really believe in it, but wanted to. I was thinking about the one rule Brad made clear we needed to follow. When we were done, we had to end the conversation. My mind took that rule and ran. We never finished the game. I rolled over, looking out my window now. The wind was picking up and caused the light from the street lamps to flicker against the glass. My eyes picked up a shape, a human shape, in the shadows of our next-door neighbor's hedges. I saw a sliver of that porcelain skin. Then it was gone. Was that him? Had I seen the harvester? Stop it. You're scaring yourself. Just go to bed. I rolled onto my back and shut my eyes. It felt like this was going to be a long night. I finally drifted off. The sleep was restless, filled with nightmares of long hallways, with many doors, all darkened by the silhouette of the harvester. In my last dream, the static fuzz that accompanies the end of a VHS finishing its recording drifted in. Then I was in bed, laying on my back. I could hear the TV fuzz clearly. Someone had been watching something. I rolled onto my side and looked down. The TV was that static fuzz, but I saw Davy's foot, his Freddy Krueger-themed socks, pulled through the TV screen. My heart stopped and I shot back in bed. I was pressed into the top corner of my room, unable to see the screen. I didn't want to. Had I just seen what I thought I'd seen? Was that actually his foot? I knew I saw his sock, but had it really been pulled through the screen? I gathered my courage and crawled back to the edge of my bunk and looked down. Jeff and Brad's sleeping bags were empty. Between them, the board game was set up. All the pieces were placed where we'd left off. I was so scared to look down and see what was in my brother's bed. Disturbing visions of the harvester, stringy hair, long gangly arms wrapped around Davy was all I could think of, but I peeked under. His bed was empty too. I was the only one in the room. I climbed the ladder down from my bunk and inspected the board. The pieces were in the same places, but they were different. They didn't look like random little boys anymore. They looked like Brad, like Jeff, like Davy, like me. We were all there. I reached out to pick up my piece, but felt a shock spark through me. The room got really bright, and I realized the TV screen was now inches from my nose. And the next second, I felt my body passing through something like a flurry of snow. Then a late November wind rushed overhead. It got dark. I got up, feeling 4 walls of dirt around me. My eyes adjusted, and I realized I was in an empty grave. It was about 6 feet high, but I could reach the top and pull myself up. I looked out and saw I was in the graveyard from the game. The same mausoleum sat in the distance, the one Jeff didn't make it through. Oh my God, I was in the game. And that concludes part 1 of Don't Look Behind You. Be sure to check back in on Monday night for part 2 and see if the boys can make their way home.